Good morning, America. Today we're continuing our series on World War I, and I'm going to talk about how the United States of America got involved in this whole mess. Now, World War I started in 1914. However, the United States was not involved in the war from the beginning. On the contrary, the United States was very proud of staying out of this mess. The American attitude towards World War I when it first started was we didn't like the Germans all that much because there were newspaper reports about the Germans doing mean things to the Belgians, which were true. But American attitude overall was, look, if Europeans want to go kill each other, that's great. Have fun, knock yourselves out, leave us out of it. We don't want to have anything to do with your dumb European war. And that continued to be the American attitude for quite some time. Now, there were some events that might possibly have changed that attitude, but they did not. So let's talk this through. All right, so an important event that occurred relating to America's involvement in World War I that did not result in America actually entering the war was the sinking of the Lusitania. All right, the Lusitania was a cruise ship. Well, today we call it a cruise ship. Back then it was called an ocean liner, back in the days when ships were still a necessary means of transportation between the United States and Europe prior to the invention of transcontinental air travel. The Lusitania was a British-owned and operated ocean liner that made regular passenger voyages between New York and London. Because it was a British-owned ship, that meant that it was liable to being fired on by the German Navy. In fact, Germany had recently announced that they would be carrying out unrestricted submarine warfare. And if a British ship encountered a German U-boat on the high seas, they were likely to be fired upon. The Lusitania, as a British ship, would therefore be at risk of being fired upon if it encountered a German U-boat on the high seas. The German government tried to run advertisements in New York warning Americans not to sail on board the Lusitania. However, those advertisements did not run until it was too late. The Lusitania set sail on her regularly scheduled voyage from New York to London. Since it was departing from New York, there were many Americans on board. Partway across the ocean in May 1915, sure enough, the Lusitania encountered a German U-boat on the high seas. The U-boat opened fire on the Lusitania, and the Lusitania sank rapidly with the loss of almost all passengers on board, including numerous Americans. The Lusitania sank very quickly when she was hit. Some historians speculate that she may have been carrying explosives on board in her cargo hold, which would have been a violation of the rules to carry explosives on a passenger ship, but, well, the rules might have been broken. The wreck of the Lusitania has actually been found. It's lying on the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. However, the side of the ship that was hit by the U-boat is buried face down in the mud at the bottom of the ocean, so we're not able to tell whether or not the ship might have exploded, so that mystery will probably never be solved. But in any case, the ship sank very quickly and everybody on board died. Americans were outraged that many of their citizens had been killed on board the ship. However, the sinking of the Lusitania did not result in the United States entering World War I, because the sinking, and that's clear when you look at the timeline, the sinking of the Lusitania occurred in May 1915. The United States did not enter World War I until January 1917, which was well over a year later, coming up on 2 years later. And in between those two, in 1916, Woodrow Wilson actually won re-election for president on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." That was Wilson's re-election slogan, and clearly a majority of Americans supported it because he won re-election. Yet I read in history books, textbooks sometimes that, oh, the sinking of the Lusitania caused the United States to enter World War I. No, it didn't. That's not right. So if it wasn't the sinking of the Lusitania, then what actually caused the United States to enter World War I? Well, I'm glad you asked. The United States entered World War I as a result of an incident called the Zimmerman telegram incident. Now remember, a telegram is how people communicate back in those days. It's a letter sent over electrical wires. It's the really only method of fast, long-distance written communication prior to the invention of the internet and the fax machine. So what happened here? All right, so in early 1917, Germany got a brilliant idea. This is on par with the Schlieffen plan. It's so brilliant. That was sarcasm. Germany's brilliant plan is, let's invite Mexico to join the Central Powers. And if they do, we will promise Mexico that we will see to it that they get back all the American territory that they lost as a result of the Texas Revolution, then the 19th century war with Mexico, and the Gadsden Purchase. That was Germany's brilliant idea. Now, Germany, in order to make this offer to Mexico, the German government sent instructions to their ambassador in Mexico City to instruct him to make this offer to the Mexican government. Those instructions were sent by telegram over the transatlantic telegraph cable. The transatlantic telegraph cable ran through England, which meant that England intercepted that telegram message as it went by. Now, the Germans planned for that, though. They suspected that the message might be intercepted, so they had sent it in code, in a secret code. And they thought that even if the British intercepted the message, they wouldn't be able to read it because it was in code. But what the Germans didn't know was that the British had broken their secret codes. So when the British intercepted the message, they were able to break the code and read the message. And they said, oh, I say, old chap, I think the United States might be a bit interested in reading this. And so they forwarded the decoded message to the United States government. President Wilson read the telegram and he was outraged. Congress read the message and they also were outraged. The message was published in the newspapers and made headlines across America. Ordinary Americans were outraged. President Wilson said, this amounts to a declaration of war by Germany. They're trying to stir up our next door neighbor against us. Things have gone too far. This is now a war of self-defense for the United States. We can't sit out any longer. We have to get involved. And so Wilson, burning with righteous indignation, goes to Congress, asks Congress for a declaration of war, and the United States joins World War I and joins the Allies. Ironically, Mexico never did join the Central Powers, and there was really little or no chance that they were actually going to do so. Mexico was what we would call today, in modern-day language, close to a failed state in the 1910s. Its government was weak and unorganized, and Mexico was dealing with a rebellion led by a rebel/bandit leader named Pancho Villa, that the Mexican government never did succeed in suppressing. It was actually American troops that finally put down Pancho Villa and his rebels, not the Mexican government. Mexico was certainly in no position to go to war against the Allies. But this, nevertheless, this incident was responsible for bringing the United States into the war. However, when the United States joined World War I, we were woefully unprepared for this conflict. So, World War I was a draft war. The government started drafting people into the war, but it took time for Americans to be drafted, to have some semblance of training, that be given weapons and uniforms, then be put on ships, sail all the way over to France, and then get to the front lines in France. So the United States entered World War I in early 1917, but large numbers of Americans didn't actually make it to the front we finally started fighting really in the spring of 1918. So it was really about a whole year almost before the United States, from the time we entered the war to when we were actually able to make a significant contribution to it. So the United States was involved in World War I for about 2 years, just slightly less than 2 years. But we really actually only had significant numbers of troops fighting on the Western Front for 1 year, 1918. World War I was a total war for the United States. Ordinary Americans had to sacrifice. There was rationing, propaganda, things like that. But it was a relatively short duration, less than 2 years. So it was a very intense war effort by the American public, but a relatively brief one. And that's it for today.